Hello everybody, it's terrific to be here talking about ethical leadership, and we really want this to be the pointy end of the conference. We actually want to have a lot of engagement. We don't think this is a simple topic. If it feels like we're all sitting sort of vehemently agreeing, I think we haven't achieved anything. I think it's really important that we do understand that these are quite tricky conversations, and we ask the hard questions. If there's a question that comes to your mind, either put it through the IML system, and there's a little thing here and I can read it out, or stand up if you're not somehow connected or if your question's not being asked. So we do really want to get some interaction. I wanted to start, though, with one of my favourite authors and one of my favourite books. It's called Oh, the Places You'll Go by Dr. Seuss. And he says something like, we have brains in our heads and feet in our shoes, and we can go any direction we choose. I love that, but I don't think it's actually true. It's what I tell my kids, but I kind of cringe because I think there are all sorts of dilemmas. It's just not as simple as that, and that's what I hope we'll be talking about today. So I also want to challenge us not to do too much social loafing. Has everyone heard of that concept of social loafing? It's the idea that we actually don't work nearly as hard in a group as when we're working on our own. And I think in this area of thinking and trying to solve problems, if we're here as a great big group, we don't all really put our mind to it. And I'd really like us all to think about what we can do, what we should be doing, how we can actually make a difference as a result of some of the things that we're hearing today. And also to ask ourselves continually throughout this, are we actually in any way complicit in the bad behaviour that we'll actually be talking about today? We'll hear some examples of quite bad behaviour, and we have to really rack our minds and say, are we somehow complicit? Because today I don't want us all just to be, almost voyeuristically listening to these issues. We are people, we are some of us employers, we mothers and fathers, as well as people in the government. We actually play many roles. We're very privileged to be here. How fabulous to be here for a few days thinking about stuff. So we have a huge responsibility, I think. Let me just tell you, when I started at Roy Morgan Research some 30 years ago, 1983, I did the most exciting study I've ever done. Nothing has surpassed this study. It was called the World Values Study. It was set up by the Catholic Church because they were having real concerns that there were few people turning up to church. They wanted to understand what were the values, what were the issues, how did they actually grapple with that? I'm not going to tell you all about the results of the survey, but there are a couple that stood out. 8 in 10 Australians drink less than the average. Good? What a good country. Most people believe that most Australians don't take any notice of the 10 Commandments these days, but most people actually abide by them themselves. So we obviously interviewed a really good group of people. They were non-drinking, God-fearing people that we surveyed. Of course they weren't. And this is one of the really big issues. That's this issue of being complicit and being absolutely honest about what we're saying and believing, and not just knowing it's a good idea but not really practising it ourselves and being honest with ourselves. Okay, the other thing that came through in the survey, 1983, 18% of people said women should stay at home and leave running the country to men. So if we have the first question from IML, do you believe that? Do you think the survey was right in 1983? Do you think people were saying that 18% of people would say women should stay at home and leave running the country to men? Let's see how this technology works. How many say yes? Right, wouldn't want to be in the way of the screen. Is anyone clicking? Does anyone have a view? We have a room full of unbelievers.
1 second left. No, 1 second left before it closes. We're giving them 15 seconds.
Oh.
There you
go. Okay, so those people who said no, the majority of you don't think that that was the situation in 1983. I'm going to come back to that. That's interesting. It's a bit of a test of the technology. So how many people in the room today believe that women should stay at home and leave running the country to men? I think we've got 15 seconds, have we? And I haven't got a counter, so just get your answers in quickly.
Would we run the country from home?
Why not?
Yeah, I'm just asking.
I think that's a really good idea.
Test of courage. I love working from home.
Here's a counter here, 10.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5. Oh, we get the answer right on the dot of 0, do we?
No, we'll lock it off on 0. There you go.
Right. IML, who said yes? Okay, let me just share with you. In the last few years, since 1983, that number, that 18% who said women should stay at home, leave running the country to men, has trended down, down, a little bit each year. It stuck at about 7%. That was kind of the same 7% that said you couldn't possibly have a female Prime Minister. That was just before Julia Gillard came in. And then what we found over the last few years is that the percentage of Australian people who believe women should stay at home and leave running the country to men has started to creep up. So it's sitting today about 9.5. As a reference point, in America, before the global financial crisis, 13% of Americans said women should stay home, leave running the country to men. Now, after the global financial crisis, it's about 24%. So I find these things kind of really hard to believe. I imagine some of you do as well. But it's the sort of stuff that we should sort of take an interest in, I think. So we're going to hear from some amazing people, and they're each going to give us their point of view, and we're going to do it in a fairly traditional way. We'll have 3 minutes from each, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions, discussion, and there'll be questions of the group to the group, and there'll be questions that come from you, or whichever way we all want this to work. Now, let me just get my key piece of paper. So we're going to start number 1 with Elizabeth Broderick, who's the Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner. And Elizabeth's also a member of the World Bank's Advisory Council on Gender and Development, a member of the University of Technology Sydney, their advisory board, and the Vic Health Advisory Board and Supply Nation. So Elizabeth, what's your thoughts?
Thanks, Michelle, and also a mother of 2 teenage kids, which actually keeps me busy most of the time. But I'm fascinated. I have to find out who the 3.3% of people are in the audience. And I'm surprised to see that the US, it went up. I mean, who created the global financial crisis? Who got us into it? They said if there were Lehman sisters, not Lehman brothers, we would have been okay. But anyway, that's a whole separate thing. But it's terrific to be here to look at the issue of ethical leadership. And for me, that's very much underpinned by human rights principles. When I look at leaders who are leading ethically, I think they start with the premise around dignity and respect. It's about treating everyone with dignity and respect. It's about human rights starts at home. And I really take up Michelle's point. We can be complicit in the bad behaviour unless we understand that we need to actually be those values that we actually espouse. But I'd like to posit today that we won't have ethical leadership in Australia until power is shared in this country. And for me, I suppose as a Sex Discrimination Commissioner, I'm talking about power being shared between men and women. And that creates a whole lot of ethical dilemmas. I mean, Sheryl Sandberg wrote her book which said Women Lean In, or Lean In it was called. Well, that won't happen unless men start to lean out a bit. And that's about loosening men's grip on power. And when I talk about men and women in this example, I mean, power in this country, it doesn't matter what sector you look at, is held by white Anglo-Saxon men. And those men are absolutely part of the solution to the sharing of power. But I do think it raises a whole lot of ethical dilemmas, and I just want to share a couple with you. More recently, I've created a group of powerful men in Australia, some of the leaders of our iconic companies like Telstra, like Qantas, like CBA, like the head of Prime Minister, the head of the Army, the head of Treasury, and I brought those men together, and the reason I did that was because I started to understand that if we want to create shared leadership in this country, we need powerful men taking the message of gender equality to other men, That's what's going to shift it. But in the discussions that the men have had, because they've been out in their own organisations, they've been asked questions such as, and they've run a number of all men-only focus groups, where one CEO told me he was asked the question, so are you suggesting that as a man in this organisation, it's going to be harder for me to get ahead in the future? Is that what you're truly suggesting? And I was interested to see the CEO's response, and he said, Liz, I said to him, yeah, that's exactly what I'm suggesting, because think of it this way, how's it been for women for the last 200 years? So I think when we look at sharing of power, it is about the day-to-day ethical dilemmas that we come across. So, for example, we've got two people presenting for a role. It's the senior role. Are we going to take the man who's had an unbroken track record, who's performed very well and can clearly do the job, or are we going to take a chance on the woman who's maybe been in and out of paid work because of caring responsibility, is very talented in skills and has absolutely the potential to succeed? They're the type of ethical dilemmas that I think we come across if we are serious about sharing power in this country, and particularly that shared power leading to better and more ethical decision making. Thank you.
Terrific. So can we hear from you, Carol? We're just going to go straight through and have lots of questions and discussion later. So Carol is a dynamic business leader. She's the chair of Creative Partnerships Australia, Our Community and Women's Leadership Institute Australia, and a director of Stockland and Bank of Melbourne. Carol Schwartz is one of Australia's most dynamic business leaders, with a career now spanning over 2 decades. Having been nominated an eminent business leader by the Australian government, Carol has conducted significant inquiries on behalf of the government, chaired major government boards, as well as chairing and participating in high-level private company and listed company boards. So you bring an enormous breadth of experience.
Thanks,
what
Michele.
Can you tell us?
And hi, everyone. And firstly, I would like to begin by acknowledging the amazing work that Liz Broderick has been doing. I have worked alongside Liz for a couple of years now, and I have to say that her initiatives and her risk-taking have been absolutely superb, not only in the areas of championing women for leadership roles in our corporate community, but also her amazing work in the military, which I hope she's going to talk about a little bit later on, and also on domestic violence. So I guess in a way I'm representing the corporate world here, and there have been a number of interesting issues that have been raised. I mean, I guess there are always interesting issues raised around ethics and leadership in the corporate world. And I recently read an article by Simon Longstaff. And Simon Longstaff is the head of the St James Ethics Centre on this very issue of ethics and ethical dilemmas in business. And he said that the two attributes that a real leader has to have in setting ethical standards in their business are moral courage and strategic vision. Moral courage and strategic vision. And I absolutely agree with it, because I think that in this globalised world of business, we are dealing with real issues around cultural differences, what is acceptable in one nation, in one geographical area that is not acceptable in another. What about rules and laws that conflict? Now, Australia's been really good at encapsulating a lot of our, if you like, generic ethical standards and behaviours in our rules and regulations. And often they clash very much with nations that we might consider doing business with. So that's an interesting issue that we in business have to face. And I think that at the end of the day, an organisation, a corporation, a business is actually going to be led in its ethical standards by the person who is running that business. And if that person does not have strategic vision and moral fortitude, then it can really go off the rails. And I'm looking forward to discussing that with all of you today.
Great, thanks, Carol. Now, I'd like to hear from Deborah Cheetham. So, Deborah's an Indigenous cultural leader, a Yorta Yorta woman, soprano, composer and author. As the founder of the Schwartz Black Opera Company, she's also Associate Dean of Indigenous Studies and Head of the Willan Centre for Indigenous Arts at the Faculty of the VCA and MCM, University of Melbourne. So Deborah, what views can you bring us?
Thanks so much for that introduction. You know, every day I actually live and work on the land of the Wurundjeri people. They're part of the Kulin Nation. And for 1,000 generations, all the knowledge and wisdom of those people have been poured into this land, the land that we're meeting on right here today. 1,000 generations, you know, it's really difficult to get your head around that number. Sometimes I'll hear people arguing over, oh, Aboriginal people, have they been here 70,000 years or is it 50,000? I'm happy to give you 20,000 as short change. 20,000. I can give that away. So let's say conservatively, 50,000 years, the longest continuing culture in the world. So what can we learn from this? How can we, let's say, apply an indigenous lens to this question of ethical leadership? What cost will ethical leadership ask of us? You know, I think it begins with honesty. And honesty takes courage. And although we have a global audience here today, let's start with the country, the only country in the world that can lay claim to the longest continuing culture, the accumulated wisdom of those 1,000 generations. The honesty that we need to search for in Australia is who we are and how we've arrived at this moment. You know, this land that we're meeting on today, and we're raising this very important question, this land has a long memory. And yet so many Australians are disconnected from that memory, are content in a way to, if they take up the indigenous lens at all, they've got it turned around the wrong way. And indigenous everything seems very distant and remote and almost frozen in time. So I'd like to open up a discussion with you today in acknowledging that here we are in the lands of the Kulin Nation, the Wurundjeri people. How might we apply the indigenous lens? What can we learn from the longest continuing culture? What did it take? What does it take us still to remain? It takes honesty. Can Australia be as honest as it needs to be about its history and its beginnings since colonisation? I have to believe that we can in order to achieve what I'd like to achieve. So I open that up for discussion.
What an amazing construct. That's not at all what I expected to hear. Absolutely fabulous. Rufus, you have to follow that. Rufus Black, ethicist, theologian, Master at Ormond College, University of Melbourne, Master of Ormond College and a Principal Fellow in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Melbourne, ethicist, strategic advisor and theologian, expert on ethical public policy and education issues. So it sounds like you could put a spin or another lens on anything. What have you got to say today?
It is, can I begin by acknowledging Deborah's kind of extraordinary kind of contribution, because I think what she invites us to do is actually what I want to invite in a different context, which is to reconnect with the deep traditions to which we belong. If we're going to navigate through the extraordinary set of ethical challenges that face us today, and which everyone here has mentioned, and that will keep accelerating as the world gets more complex, more interdependent, and technologies accelerate more rapidly, if ethical leadership is about not just knowing what to do, but doing what's right, knowing what's right and doing what's right, the very task today of knowing what's right is more difficult than it's ever been before, mostly because we live in such a culturally fractured community where we've become disconnected from our traditions of clear moral thought. If there's a prevailing moral thought left in our community, it's largely utilitarian, a greatest good for the greatest number, and it's allied almost entirely with economic thought, which means that we really become a community dedicated to the greatest profit for the greatest number, rather than a purpose-driven community. We've disconnected in lots of ways. I mean, we're not just disconnected from an indigenous history, we're disconnected in lots of ways from our own deeper moral traditions, which once made a communal debate about what mattered, what purpose was, what our collective enterprise was in a much deeper way, accessible to us all. We have to reconnect to those traditions if we're to see serious moral leadership. But actually the very task then of being a moral leader has got a whole lot more difficult. There are lots of people who know what's right, but actually doing what's right's got lots more difficult. The scale of organisations, to have moral courage, and I think Simon's absolutely on the money, to have moral courage in a large organisation, not just so much at the top but in the middle, where the peer pressures to actually conform with what may be really unsatisfactory ways of behaving are incredibly difficult. The failures of moral leadership, certainly they can be at the top, but there is much elsewhere in organisations where the challenges of doing that are great, and half the time we're not even aware of what's going on inside ourselves. The upside of all of this is, I think, that we live in a time where we can reconnect to those traditions if we take seriously the still open promise of the moral failures of the global financial crisis and the issues that are in front of us, to say we've not been well served by the thinking that we've had and that we need to adopt, I think, return to some deeper traditions of thinking. And if in learning to do what's right, we embrace a lot of what we now know from neuroscience and behavioural psychology about what's going on in our heads. So we get more skillful, more reflective, more capable at making those choices. And the more we start to do those collectively, the easier it will get for everybody to exercise moral leadership.
Okay, has anyone on this group got any burning question that they'd like to put in response to any of these points before we open to the audience? And please send your questions in. I'm looking here, I've got no questions yet.
I have one comment, Rufus, that did you sense a slight shift there from ethical to moral? And are they actually the same thing? And maybe they are, but that was the language, and the way we frame the question is always so important and tells us a lot about where you're hoping to end up. So I just wanted to... Was that a deliberate or just organic?
Look, it was organic, but I think there is you can tease them apart. And a way of teasing them apart is to say moral is what the prevailing norms are about what's right. They're embodied in communities, organisations. What's ethical is when we step back from all of that and think it all through for ourselves from first principles where we arrive at. The ethical and the moral may part company, and I think one of our constant kind of tasks is to be engaging in ethical reflection so we can be asking questions about our social and organisational moral norms.
And I'd like to, if I may, extend something that Liz said, which is about power sharing, because I'm on a bit of a rampage at the moment about power sharing, and that has to do with the ultimate decision-making body in this country, our cabinet, which is comprised of 18 men and 1 woman. That's 18 men who all look quite similar, and 1 woman who tends to be overseas by virtue of her job quite a lot of the time. Now, one must have been living under a rock for the last 5 years if one believes that the best decision-making comes out of a completely homogenous group. Every study, every piece of research that has been done over the last few years has shown that the best decision-making comes out of a diverse group. Now, this really worries me because this particular cabinet is making very fundamental decisions about our economy, our businesses, our society, how we distribute foreign aid, how we conduct ourselves as a nation. This cabinet of 18 men and 1 woman are making very, very fundamental decisions about how we're moving forward. And I am absolutely petrified as to what impact that's going to have on us as a nation.
Can you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with Carol in that today, women are the majority of the Australian population. We make up 50.8% of Australia's population. We're, in terms of university and tertiary educated, 60% of graduates from university are female, yet in every decision-making area, whether it's the cabinet, which is a very visible example, but through to pretty much every sector in this country, including business. And if you look at the ASX 200, only 3% of CEOs are women, 3%. In a country where we've been leading on women's education for many years. But it's the ethical dilemmas that happen every day, as we talked about. The fact that the whole system that exists at the minute rewards what I call the ideal worker model, that is someone who is available 24/7, no visible caring responsibilities, and as a result of that, preferably male. You put that model together with the ideal mother belief. So if you were educated and born in Australia, you believe that good mothers are always with their children. Now, they can be drinking, gambling, abusing. It doesn't really matter. If you're with your children, that's what a good mother looks like. And we know it's much more complicated or much more complex and nuanced than that. But I think it's the dilemmas that we have every day which lead to the fact that there are no women very few women in power in this country.
Can I raise a question from the audience that's come in here, and this person says, and it's M1A1, so it's somebody we don't know. I think that men in power do a good job generally, and I don't feel they should lean out just so that women feel equal. As a woman, I don't feel disadvantaged. What I'm interested in is who can do a good job, man or woman.
Ah, the meritocracy.
Okay. I'd love to reply to that.
Go for it.
Go for it.
You might even want to stand up when you do it.
No, just look, I hear that view put very, very regularly, and I absolutely agree. There are so many great ethical male leaders in this country today. That's a good starting point. But the fact is, we fundamentally believe that organisations in Australia today are meritocracies. And I'd ask us to reflect on the question, do we think merit is evenly distributed between the sexes, men and women? Now, most people will agree with that proposition, not everyone. The shock jocks, 3AW, don't necessarily agree with that proposition. But if you believe that merit is evenly distributed between the sexes, how can we account for the fact that we have so few women at the top of organisations? And then you start talking to people like that about that, and it's about personal choice. It's about women's personal choice to go and care for their children. The fact is, we live in a world where structures, practices, the walls and floors of organisations, that gender asbestos is built into those walls and floors, and where you can't actually put your finger on it, but the whole system goes to reinforce disadvantage for a particular group. And in my view, that group's actually women with caring responsibilities.
Also, I think that's a really, really narrow point of view. I'm sorry, M1A1. Honestly, it seems like you must be very well paid, you must have never experienced slavery or sex traffic. You must be living in a very ideal world. It's not the experience of most women in the world that it's fair. And are you happy with the way the world is at the moment? We've just narrowly emerged from a GFC. Are you really saying that men are doing such a good job? I completely reject that this is the best we could be, M1A1, I'm sorry. I reject that this is the best we could be. I live in hope. I'm an optimist. I'm a Sagittarian. I can't help it.
I've got another question here. How do women gain better recognition when even at a conference like this, many of the recognised leaders presenting are men? This session is an exception. Yeah. Who's got some ideas about really practical ones?
We'll have a man on the panel speak.
Yeah.
I have to answer that question. Ooh, controversy.
I don't know that you've got one,
Well, while you're coming on stage, there is a group of men who won't share a platform unless there's an equal number of women on it. I reckon that's a terrific thing.
That was Liz's initiative.
Well, Liz,
and that is I worked out that this group of 21 men will present at 1,000 conferences on average a year, so that's aviation, security, finance or whatever. They did one simple thing. They said, from here on in, we don't speak at conferences, or we won't accept invitations to speak at conferences where there aren't a good representation of women on the panel. And that one shift has meant I've never had so many conference organisers ring me saying, where are these women? Actually, that's your problem. I can tell you they're absolutely out there. But that one small shift, taking the panel pledge, which I would encourage everyone in this audience to do, because if we want sharing of power, if we want better balance across our country, which leads, as Carol says, to optimum decision-making, ethical decision-making, we need power to be shared.
Can I just raise another point? How
You've
many
got
women...
a pledge from me now.
How many women have helped a man look fantastic? How many have written his speech and groomed him and told him where to breathe and which way to look so he looks fantastic? And how many men have helped a woman look fantastic and doing her bit when she's standing up taking the job that he was meant to do? So there's some really practical things that people can do. I'm not doing a hand count. Nobody needs to be embarrassed. Just go away with the fire in your belly to do different things. Tanya?
You know, I'd just like to comment on that point, because, like, being a woman and the curator of this conference, I tried really hard to get a gender balance and a diverse balance at this conference. And by the way, I don't think diversity is just about gender balance, and I'm sure that none of us do here on the stage either. So I tried to get a generational balance, a cultural balance and a gender balance. Now, I asked probably more women than men to speak at this conference, but many of them did not want to speak because some of them do feel uncomfortable speaking on stage in public. And we discussed this earlier, so it's also a question of women speaking up, being present with their voices, literally, and having their voice heard. I think that is extremely important. Two of the women that I did ask to speak at this conference were confirmed. They were in the program and they both pulled out. What can I say?
Can I just say one thing on that? Because Tanya's had me hassling her for years and years about making sure that there's a gender balance. And in fact, I do have to concur with Tanya, though, to an extent, because I actually run a database called Women for Media, because I am absolutely sick of journalists who say, well, you know, we just can't find any women experts to talk on any of these areas of business. There are no women accountants, there are no women economists, there are no women lawyers.
There's no women thinkers.
Yeah.
Can I say
so what I've done is I've created a database which I've called Women for Media, and what I have become is actually a resource for journalists. They have no excuse not to use women as experts in the field of business and finance and politics, because there is a database of over 120 who are also available as speakers. But to back up what Tanya's saying, there is a reticence amongst some women who are not used to, performing on the public stage, and that is real. They're not being coy. They're actually not experienced. So what I offer media training, free media training. I offer free op-ed writing so that they can get their opinions out there, and we sort of ghostwrite their opinions. But maybe what I can suggest, Tanya, is maybe through your organisation you could run some sort of public speaking training for
Women
for
Find Your Voice.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I like that name.
Yeah, Women Find Your Voice. Let's do it, girls.
Okay, I've got someone from the audience who says we're missing the point completely, which is just great. So is the point being missed in this debate about women in positions of power? A white Anglo-Saxon woman in her 50s is not that different to her male equivalent. She thinks similarly. Diversity is much broader than that. The real ethical dilemma is how we get diversity of thought to drive innovation and growth. And like that.
Yeah,
I agree.
Well, it's good to broaden the discussion.
Yeah,
I think.
I mean, and diversity, you're absolutely right. But the fact is, you know, and this is an issue that I've thought about a lot, and particularly in the context of Australia and quotas, because I've always thought, you know, well, why don't we have quotas for women? And you know why? Because actually women are not a minority in this country. We should not need quotas for women. And we should not need an excuse around diversity to have women sharing power in this country, because actually we are more than 50% of the population. We are making more than 50% of the contribution to our society. We need to be involved in the decisions that shape our community.
I think the diversity goes back to the very first moment that colonisation began in Australia. The principle behind colonisation was what? 2 words. Can anybody say what they were? Terra nullius. So the colonisers saw themselves as homogenous. They weren't. The Chinese were here 5 minutes later. Let's remember that. So there's this concept of the homogenous and the monoculture almost. And even within Aboriginal cultures, everybody envisage a map of Australia. Now, if you can, superimpose the map of Europe and the UK on top of our continent. It doesn't even touch the sides. So not even Aboriginal culture is a monocultural homogenous. So there's unrecognised diversity everywhere. We were talking out the back before we came on stage, and Michele was really encouraging me to say, how are you going to get involved? We need this to be pointy. And I thought, oh, Lord, don't invite me to do that. I didn't know which hat I was going to wear. Was I going to come out here as a soprano and blast you all away with this very close microphone as an Aboriginal woman? Or was I just going to say, look, as a lesbian, really, if I marry my partner tomorrow, hands up all the heterosexuals in the room. Please, hands up if you're heterosexual and you don't mind outing yourself. You know, leave your hand up if you really think that me marrying my partner Tony is going to diminish your marriage or the people around you. And if you don't think it will diminish it, then please go and speak to your friends and say, I think it'll be okay. We don't understand diversity here. We never did, and it goes back to my original point. What appetite for the truth do we have? What appetite for the truth? There was... I'm not going to use emotional language here, but there was a policy of extermination across this continent of the most diverse, longest continuing culture in the world. If we can't talk about that, and if we can't apply it, if we can't make it relevant in our conversation, our decision-making process, we haven't grappled the truth as Australians. We don't understand diversity. We never did.